The morning mist hung heavy over Senlac Hill, October 14th, 1066. 7,000 Anglo-Saxon warriors lay dead or dying on the slopes below Hastings. King Harold Godwinson's body, pierced by Norman arrows, would never again defend English soil. The Ravens had already begun their work. Norman knights picked through the wreckage of shields and spears, searching for survivors to ransom or finish. Duke William of Normandy stood victorious on ground that had belonged to England since the time of Alfred the Great. The silence that follows slaughter had settled over the battlefield like a shroud. But the catastrophe that ended Anglo-Saxon rule in England did not begin with the famous Norman cavalry charges. It did not start with the feigned retreats that lured English warriors from their defensive positions. It did not even begin with the arrow that found Harold's eye in the battle's final hour. It began 3 hours earlier when a single Anglo-Saxon scout named Leofric the Keen-Eyed made a decision that would echo through centuries. A decision to light a beacon fire, 30 minutes too soon. The smoke from that fire would rise into an October sky and carry with it the fate of a kingdom. One signal, one mistake, one moment when individual judgment transformed into historical catastrophe. The beacon that was meant to save Harold's army instead delivered it to destruction. This is the story of how the Norman conquest began, not with William's invasion fleet crossing the Channel, not with Harold's desperate forced march from the north, but with a scout's premature warning that created the very crisis it was designed to prevent. A tale of how communication failure, multiplied by the chaos of battle, can unravel kingdoms and reshape civilizations. The sun was setting over the downs of East Sussex as 7,000 Anglo-Saxon warriors took their positions along the ridge that would be remembered as Senlac Hill. They had marched 250 miles in 6 days, covering ground at a pace that would have impressed Roman legions. Many had not eaten a proper meal in 48 hours. Few had slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since leaving the smoking ruins of Stamford Bridge 3 weeks earlier. King Harold Godwinson moved among his men as they prepared their defences, his presence both reassuring and sobering. At 44 years of age, Harold bore the scars of 2 decades in almost continuous warfare. A pale line across his left cheek marked a Welsh spear thrust from the campaign of 1062. His right shoulder, broken by a Viking axe at Stamford Bridge, still ached in the October cold. But his eyes remained sharp, his voice carried clearly across the ridge, and his hands were steady as he examined the ground where England's fate would be decided. The ridge his army occupied rose nearly 200 feet above the valley floor where Duke William's Norman forces had made their camp. From the crest, Harold could see the glow of hundreds of campfires scattered across the valley like fallen stars. The Norman army was massive, 8,000 men, according to his scouts, and well supplied. Their invasion fleet, drawn up on the beaches at Pevensey, stretched for miles along the coast. But the ridge itself offered significant advantages to the defender. The slope was steep enough to break cavalry charges, perhaps 30 degrees in most places, but not so steep as to prevent infantry movement or the construction of defensive positions. The southern face, where the main assault would come, was relatively clear of obstacles, allowing Harold's men to form their shield wall without obstruction. Dense woodland of oak and ash protected the eastern flank, making it nearly impossible for cavalry to operate effectively. Marshy ground extended along the western approach, channeling any attack toward the center where Harold's strongest forces waited. The king's army was not at full strength. The rapid march from York had cost him nearly 2,000 men to desertion, exhaustion, and minor injuries that became major impediments during forced marches. The levies from the northern shires, exhausted by their victory over Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, had been given permission to return to their homes before the southern campaign began. The Fyrd militia from Kent and Sussex had answered Harold's summons, but many were farmers and craftsmen whose military training consisted of occasional weekend musters and local conflicts with bandits. The core of Harold's army consisted of approximately 3,000 housecarls, professional warriors who served the king directly and formed the military elite of Anglo-Saxon England. These men carried Danish axes capable of splitting Norman mail with a single blow, wore byrny coats of interlocked rings that had turned aside Viking swords and Welsh spears, and had sworn blood oaths to die before allowing their king to fall in battle. They would form the centre of the Anglo-Saxon line, the anvil upon which Norman attacks would shatter. Supporting the housecarls were roughly 4,000 furred militia, part-time soldiers who brought their own weapons and equipment to the king's service. Their gear varied enormously, from well-crafted swords and mail shirts owned by prosperous farmers to simple spears and leather jerkins carried by village craftsmen. Their military value varied just as widely, but their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their personal stake in defending their homeland made them formidable in defensive combat. Harold's battle plan was deceptively simple in concept, but complex in execution. His forces would form a shield wall along the crest of the ridge, using interlocking shields and overlapping spear points to create an impenetrable barrier. The housecarls would hold the centre, where Norman attacks would be heaviest and where tactical discipline would be most critical. The fyrd would extend the line to cover the entire ridge, ensuring that no part of the position could be outflanked or bypassed. When Norman cavalry charged up the slope, they would meet this wall of steel and wood moving at full speed. Horses could not leap a properly constructed shield wall. The laws of physics worked against mounted warriors attacking uphill against prepared positions. Knights who dismounted to fight on foot would lose their primary advantage of mobility and height. The Normans would be forced to attack piecemeal, accepting enormous casualties for minimal territorial gain. But Harold faced a critical challenge that no amount of tactical planning could completely solve: battlefield communication. The Anglo-Saxon line extended nearly 800 yards across the ridge, a distance so great that a man standing at one end could barely see the banners at the other through the haze of an October morning. In the chaos of medieval battle, with thousands of men shouting orders, battle cries, and death screams, how could Harold coordinate the movements of his army? How could he respond to Norman tactical changes as they developed? How could he know where his line was holding firm and where it might be starting to bend or break? The solution lay in a sophisticated network of signal stations positioned at key points along and behind the battlefield. These stations, manned by experienced scouts selected for their eyesight and judgment, would observe enemy movements and relay critical information using beacon fires, horn calls, and mounted messengers. The system represented the culmination of decades of Anglo-Saxon military evolution, incorporating lessons learned from campaigns against Vikings, Welsh princes, and Scottish raiders. The communication network had worked effectively during Harold's northern campaign against Harald Hardrada. At Stamford Bridge, early warnings from scout networks had allowed the king to respond quickly to Norwegian tactical changes. When Hardrada attempted to outflank the English position by sending forces across the Derwent River upstream, Harold's scouts had provided sufficient warning for defensive adjustments that ultimately saved the battle. But Stamford Bridge had been a smaller engagement fought on more confined terrain. The battlefield at Hastings would test the communication system beyond anything it had been designed to handle. The distances were greater, the enemy more numerous, and the tactical complexity far more demanding. The scout network consisted of 12 observation posts, each manned by 2 or 3 experienced warriors selected from the ranks of the housecarls. These men were chosen for exceptional eyesight, familiarity with Norman tactics gained through previous campaigns, and proven reliability under the extreme pressure of combat. Each post was equipped with signal fires constructed from dry kindling and pitch-soaked cloth, war horns carved from oxbone or captured from defeated enemies, and fast horses for emergency message delivery to Harold's command post. The posts were positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation, while remaining far enough behind the main battle line to avoid capture during Norman advances. Each had specific responsibilities: monitoring particular sectors of the battlefield, watching for designated types of enemy movement, and maintaining communication links with adjacent stations. One of these posts, designated Station 7 in Harold's tactical planning, was positioned on a small hillock approximately 300 yards behind the main battle line. The hillock rose perhaps 20 feet above the surrounding terrain, not high enough to draw enemy attention, but sufficient to provide clear observation of Norman movements across a wide sector of the battlefield. Station 7's responsibility was to monitor enemy activity on the English right flank and provide early warning of any attempt at encirclement or flanking attack. This was a critical assignment, as the right flank represented Harold's most vulnerable position. While the left flank was anchored by marshy ground that would channel attackers toward prepared positions, the right flank was more open and could potentially be turned by a determined Norman cavalry force. The post was commanded by Leofric, son of Wulfnoth, called the Keen-Eyed for his legendary ability to identify enemy formations at distances that defied belief. At Stamford Bridge, Leofric had spotted Norwegian reinforcements crossing the Derwent River nearly an hour before they reached the battlefield, providing Harold with crucial time to reposition his reserves and prepare for the expanded assault. Leofric was 42 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Wales under Harold's father Earl Godwin and later under Harold himself in Scotland. He had served the Godwinson family for nearly 2 decades, rising from a common spearman to become one of Harold's most trusted scouts. His loyalty was absolute, proven through years of faithful service in conditions that would have broken lesser men. His judgment, until October 14th, had been considered virtually flawless. But the signal system, sophisticated as it was, contained a fundamental vulnerability that would prove catastrophic when tested by the pressures of actual combat. Once a beacon fire was lit, it could not be extinguished quickly enough to recall the signal. The fires were designed to burn brightly and visibly for extended periods, a feature that made them effective for long-distance communication, but also made them impossible to cancel once ignited. Similarly, once horn calls were sounded, they could not be unheard by the units that received them. Once emergency messages were dispatched by mounted messenger, they could not be intercepted and corrected en route. The system assumed that scouts would only activate their signals in response to genuine emergencies that required immediate tactical responses. The network provided no mechanism for correcting mistaken reports, cancelling premature warnings, or updating initial assessments as situations developed. This was not considered a significant weakness during the planning phase, as the scouts were chosen specifically for their experience and judgment. The assumption was that such men would not make errors serious enough to require correction. As darkness fell on October 13th, Leofric settled into his position at Station 7 with the tools that would soon reshape English history. Dry kindling, pitch-soaked cloth strips, and a small covered brazier provided the materials for his signal fire. The kindling had been gathered from the driest wood available and arranged in a configuration that would ignite quickly when exposed to flame. The pitch-soaked strips would produce the dense black smoke that made beacon signals visible at great distances. A carved horn, taken from a Norwegian warrior at Stamford Bridge, lay ready to sound additional alarms if beacon signals proved insufficient to attract attention. The horn had been tested repeatedly and could produce notes audible across the entire battlefield under favorable wind conditions. A fast mare, saddled and ready, waited in a sheltered position nearby for emergency message runs to Harold's command post. The horse was one of the swiftest in the Anglo-Saxon army, capable of covering the ground to Harold's position in less than 5 minutes under normal circumstances. Around Station 7, the Anglo-Saxon army completed its final preparations for the battle that everyone knew would come with dawn. Weapons were sharpened on whetstones that rang in the darkness like distant bells. Armor was checked and adjusted, with particular attention paid to the leather straps and metal buckles that held mail shirts in position during combat. Final meals were consumed: bread, cheese, and ale for most men, with dried meat for those fortunate enough to possess it. Prayers were offered to Christ and his saints, asking for victory in the coming battle and salvation for souls that might soon depart their earthly bodies. But other prayers were also whispered, older invocations to gods whose names were not spoken in the presence of priests, but whose power over battle and death was still acknowledged in the secret places of Anglo-Saxon hearts. The ground had not yet shifted beneath the feet of the 7,000 warriors who would fight for England's independence. The positions were as strong as Harold's military skill could make them. The army was as ready as circumstances and exhaustion would allow. But the conditions for disaster were already in place, invisible in the October darkness, but as real as the steel weapons that waited for dawn. A communication system with no provision for error correction. A scout with exceptional skills and imperfect judgment. An enemy commander who understood the value of deception and misdirection in warfare. And a signal fire that, once lit, would burn down a kingdom and change the course of European history. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Sussex Downs, October 14th, 1066. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light wind from the north carried the scent of wood smoke and leather from both armies, mingled with the sharper odours of horses and weapons oil. Frost covered the grass on Senlac Hill, making footing treacherous for men in heavy mail who would soon be fighting for their lives. Duke William of Normandy had spent the night moving his forces into attack positions with the methodical precision that had made him master of Normandy by age 20. 8,000 men were arranged in 3 divisions according to a battle plan that reflected decades of military experience and careful study of Anglo-Saxon defensive tactics. The Bretons under Count Alan occupied the left wing, positioned to assault the Anglo-Saxon right flank, where marshy ground would channel their attack toward prepared defensive positions. These warriors, many of them veterans of campaigns in Brittany and Maine, carried shorter swords than their Norman counterparts and favoured rapid, aggressive tactics designed to overwhelm defenders through speed and ferocity. The Normans themselves, under William's direct command, formed the centre of the invasion force. This was the elite of the army, including many of the knights who had served William since his consolidation of Norman power in the 1040s and 1050s. They rode destriers' warhorses trained specifically for combat and carried lances, swords, and the distinctive kite-shaped shields that had become synonymous with Norman military prowess. The Franco-Flemish forces under Count Eustace of Boulogne held the right wing, positioned to strike the Anglo-Saxon left flank, where woodland terrain would complicate their assault, but also provide opportunities for tactical surprise. These men represented the international character of William's invasion, drawn from across northern France by promises of English land and plunder. The Norman battle plan was considerably more complex than Harold's defensive strategy. William intended to pin the Anglo-Saxon line with coordinated infantry and cavalry attacks, while his mounted forces sought weak points and opportunities for breakthrough. Norman archers, positioned in front of the main battle line, would provide supporting fire designed to disrupt Anglo-Saxon formations and create gaps that cavalry could exploit. But William also understood the psychological dimension of medieval warfare, with a subtlety that would prove decisive. Morale could collapse suddenly and catastrophically if defenders believed their position was hopeless or that they were being outmaneuvered by superior tactical skill. If he could convince Harold's army that they were surrounded, outflanked, or facing threats from multiple directions simultaneously, the Anglo-Saxon line might break without requiring the kind of costly frontal assault that could devastate the Norman army, even in victory. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, Norman horns sounded the advance across the entire front. 8,000 warriors began their march up the slope toward the Anglo-Saxon positions, their approach visible from miles away as a dark tide flowing across the Sussex countryside. From Station 7, Leofric the Keen-Eyed watched the enemy advance with the professional interest of a man who had observed such movements many times before. The Norman formation was impressive in its discipline and coordination, reflecting the kind of systematic military training that had made William's forces dominant throughout northern France. Infantry units maintained proper spacing and alignment despite the difficult terrain. Cavalry squadrons moved in support, their lances glinting in the morning sun, ready to exploit any breakthrough that infantry attacks might create. But Leofric's attention was increasingly drawn to movements in the Norman rear that seemed inconsistent with a straightforward frontal assault. Supply wagons were being repositioned away from the direct approach routes, suggesting that William expected the battle to last longer than a simple infantry charge might require. Reserve units were shifting eastward, moving toward positions that would support operations beyond the immediate battlefield. Most significantly, cavalry scouts were conducting systematic reconnaissance along the valley floor in directions that suggested preparation for flanking maneuvers. These movements were subtle, small groups of mounted warriors whose presence might easily be dismissed as routine security patrols. But their pattern and timing indicated something more sophisticated than simple battlefield reconnaissance. These observations would prove tragically prophetic, but not in the way Leofric anticipated. The Norman attack began in earnest at 9 o'clock, with a coordinated advance across the entire front. Breton infantry charged the Anglo-Saxon left flank, their battle cries echoing across the valley as they scrambled up the steep slope toward the waiting shield wall. Norman cavalry struck the centre with disciplined precision, their lances aimed at specific points in the Anglo-Saxon line where previous reconnaissance had identified potential weaknesses. Franco-Flemish archers on the right targeted the English positions with volleys of arrows designed to force defenders to raise their shields and create openings for infantry assault. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall held with the grim determination that had made English warriors legendary throughout northern Europe. For 2 hours, Norman attacks broke against the ridge like waves against a cliff, achieving nothing but casualty lists that grew longer with each assault. Anglo-Saxon axes, wielded by men who had trained with these weapons since childhood, split Norman shields and shattered Norman lances. English spears, thrust with the full force of warriors fighting for their homes and families, found gaps in Norman mail that should have been impenetrable. Horses stumbled on the steep slope, made slippery by morning frost, and increasingly treacherous as blood soaked into the earth. Norman knights, trained to fight from horseback, found themselves unhorsed and vulnerable to Anglo-Saxon weapons that were designed specifically for close-quarters infantry combat. But William had not committed all his available forces to these initial attacks. Despite the intensity of the assault, approximately half his army remained in the valley below, arranged in formations that could respond quickly to tactical developments or exploit opportunities that the preliminary fighting might create. From his observation post 300 yards behind the main battle line, Leofric monitored these reserves with growing unease that reflected both his military experience and his understanding of Norman tactical doctrine. The enemy forces in the valley were not simply waiting passively for orders, they were conducting coordinated movements that suggested active preparation for operations beyond the immediate frontal assault. Most concerning was a column of approximately 200 Norman knights that had detached from the main reserve force shortly after the battle began. This column was moving eastward along the valley floor, following a route parallel to the battlefield that would bring them around the right flank of the Anglo-Saxon position. The movement was deliberate and purposeful, conducted with the kind of tactical discipline that indicated careful planning rather than improvised response to battlefield developments. The knights maintained proper formation spacing, kept their weapons ready for immediate action, and followed a route that had obviously been reconnoitred in advance. At 11:15, this cavalry column reached a position roughly half a mile east of the main battle, where they began deploying into what appeared to be attack formation. 3 squadrons arranged in line abreast, with supporting infantry moving up behind them and scouts pushing forward to examine the Anglo-Saxon defensive positions. From Leofric's perspective, elevated 20 feet above the surrounding terrain and blessed with the exceptional eyesight that had earned him his nickname, this development looked exactly like the flanking attack he had been specifically ordered to detect. His written instructions, dictated by Harold himself during the previous evening's planning session, were explicit. If Norman forces attempted to encircle the Anglo-Saxon position, light the beacon fire immediately to provide maximum warning time for defensive adjustments. But the Norman movements that Leofric was observing with such concern were preliminary rather than definitive. The cavalry deployment was careful and methodical, but it had not yet committed to an actual attack on the Anglo-Saxon positions. What Leofric was witnessing was what military theorists would later classify as reconnaissance in force, a tactical technique designed to test enemy responses without committing to a full assault that might prove costly or unsuccessful. Duke William wanted to understand how quickly Harold could respond to threats on his flanks. Would Anglo-Saxon reserves move immediately upon detecting enemy movements? Would the shield wall remain intact under pressure from multiple directions? Could the English communication system handle the complexity of coordinating responses to simultaneous threats? The demonstration was also psychological warfare of considerable sophistication. Norman cavalry visible on the English flank would create anxiety among Harold's forces even if no actual attack materialized. Defenders forced to watch threats from multiple directions could not concentrate their full attention on any single enemy force, reducing their effectiveness in all engagements. But Leofric could not distinguish between genuine flanking attack and tactical demonstration from his position behind the main battle line. The distance was too great, the tactical situation too complex, and the pressure of combat too intense to permit the kind of careful analysis that might have revealed William's true intentions. What he could see was Norman cavalry in attack formation threatening the English right flank. What he understood from his training and experience was that such formations typically preceded immediate assault. What his orders required was immediate action to provide Harold with sufficient warning time to respond effectively. At 11:25, the Norman cavalry column completed its deployment and began advancing toward the Anglo-Saxon positions. The advance was slow and tentative, clearly reconnaissance rather than assault, but from Leofric's vantage point, it appeared to be the beginning of the flanking attack that his entire training had prepared him to detect and report. The scout faced the defining decision of his life, and unknowingly of English history itself. Should he wait until Norman intentions became completely clear, risking that his warning would come too late to be militarily effective? Or should he signal immediately while Harold still had sufficient time to respond with tactical adjustments that might prevent disaster? His training emphasized caution and precision. Wait for absolute certainty before committing to irreversible actions. Confirm enemy intentions through careful observation rather than hasty interpretation. But his experience, particularly at Stamford Bridge, where early warning had proven decisive, suggested that hesitation could be fatal in rapidly developing tactical situations. The difference between victory and defeat in medieval warfare often came down to minutes or even seconds of reaction time. Armies that responded quickly to changing circumstances survived and prevailed. Armies that hesitated while seeking perfect information were frequently destroyed by enemies who acted decisively on imperfect intelligence. The Norman cavalry column had advanced approximately 200 yards toward the Anglo-Saxon positions when Leofric made the choice that would haunt military historians for centuries. At 11:26 on the morning of October 14th, 1066, he lit the signal fire. The beacon blazed to life with startling intensity, dry kindling catching fire from the covered brazier and igniting the pitch-soaked cloth strips that produced dense columns of black smoke. The smoke rose straight into the still October air, creating a pillar visible from every position on the battlefield and for miles in all directions. Within minutes, the signal had been observed by Harold's command post in the center of the Anglo-Saxon line. Reserve units positioned across the battlefield could see the smoke clearly. The message conveyed by Leofric's beacon was unambiguous according to the predetermined communication protocols: Norman breakthrough imminent on the right flank. Reinforce immediately with all available reserves, but there was no Norman breakthrough developing on the Anglo-Saxon right flank. The cavalry demonstration continued for another 30 minutes before withdrawing to its original positions, having accomplished its limited objective of testing English responses and creating tactical uncertainty. By the time the Norman forces retreated, however, Harold had already committed his most valuable reserves to defending against a threat that existed only in Leofric's interpretation of ambiguous enemy movements. 600 housecarls, nearly half of Harold's remaining tactical reserves, were marching rapidly toward the right flank to reinforce positions that were never actually under attack. Their departure left the center of the Anglo-Saxon line dangerously thin, with insufficient tactical depth to absorb the kind of concentrated assault that Duke William was already preparing to launch. Duke William, observing the movement of Anglo-Saxon reserves from his elevated command position in the valley below, immediately understood what had occurred with the tactical insight that had made him master of Normandy. The English had fallen for a deception that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Their battle line was now vulnerable to exactly the kind of concentrated cavalry charge that could decide the engagement in a single devastating assault. The warning signs had been misread by a scout whose only error was acting 30 minutes too soon. The signal had been sent with perfect technical execution, but catastrophically poor timing. The reserves had been committed to a phantom threat that existed only in the fog of war and the pressure of combat decision-making. What happened next was inevitable. The premature beacon fire created a cascade of command failures that would paralyze Anglo-Saxon decision-making for the remainder of the battle, transforming Harold's defensive strength into fatal weakness through the unforgiving mathematics of medieval warfare. When Harold Godwinson saw the smoke rising from Station 7, he faced the kind of immediate tactical crisis that separated competent commanders from great ones. His battle plan, developed through careful study of Norman tactics and refined by decades of military experience, assumed that beacon signals would only be activated in response to actual enemy breakthroughs requiring immediate reinforcement. The sight of Leofric's fire rising into the October sky meant, according to every protocol the Anglo-Saxon army had established, that Norman forces were already engaging Harold's right flank positions with sufficient strength to threaten the integrity of the entire defensive line. This was exactly the scenario that Harold's signal system had been designed to detect and counter. But Harold could not directly observe the threatened sector from his command position in the center of the Anglo-Saxon line. The battlefield was too large, nearly a mile from end to end, the fighting too intense, and the smoke from countless individual combats too dense to permit clear observation of distant tactical developments. Medieval commanders faced a fundamental challenge that would not be solved until the advent of modern communications technology. They had to make critical decisions affecting thousands of lives based on incomplete information filtered through communication systems that were inherently vulnerable to error, delay, and misinterpretation. Harold had positioned himself according to standard military doctrine of the period. The center of the line represented the most likely point of main enemy attack, the position where his personal presence would have maximum impact on troop morale, and the location that provided optimal command and control over the entire battlefield. But this positioning also meant that he had to rely on the information provided by his scout network to understand tactical developments beyond his direct observation. That information was now catastrophically wrong, and the protocols he had established provided no mechanism for rapid verification or correction. Harold's immediate response followed established military doctrine with the precision that had made him one of Europe's most respected commanders. Threatened sectors received absolute priority for reinforcement. Available reserves moved immediately to contain enemy penetrations before they could expand into strategic breakthroughs. Speed of response often determined whether localized crises remained manageable or developed into army-destroying disasters. At 11:30, Harold dispatched 600 housecarls from his central reserve to reinforce what he believed was a developing crisis on the right flank. These were not militia troops or levy forces whose loss might be absorbed without critical damage to Anglo-Saxon fighting capability. These were professional warriors whose individual combat effectiveness was worth several times that of ordinary soldiers. The marching column, led by Elfig the Bold, one of Harold's most experienced things, covered the ground to the right flank positions at the rapid pace that Anglo-Saxon infantry had perfected during years of campaigning against enemies who valued mobility above all tactical considerations. They reached their assigned positions at approximately 11:45, only to discover a situation that bore no resemblance to the crisis they had been dispatched to resolve. There was no Norman breakthrough developing on the Anglo-Saxon right flank. The cavalry demonstration that had triggered Leofric's signal had already begun its withdrawal toward the main Norman positions. Anglo-Saxon defensive positions were intact, unchallenged, and fully capable of repelling any attack that might reasonably be expected from the enemy forces visible in the area. But military protocol, established through generations of Anglo-Saxon military tradition, required the reinforcing housecarls to remain in their assigned sector until receiving explicit orders to redeploy from Harold's command post. They could not simply return to their original positions based on local tactical assessments, no matter how obvious the absence of immediate threat might appear. This restriction was not arbitrary bureaucracy, but essential military discipline. Medieval armies that allowed individual unit commanders to redeploy forces based on their personal judgment of local conditions rapidly descended into chaos as tactical coherence dissolved into a collection of independent actions that could be defeated piecemeal by coordinated enemy forces. The requirement for centralized command authority created a communications bottleneck that would prove fatal to Anglo-Saxon hopes. Harold, still believing that his right flank was under serious attack based on Leofric's signal, continued sending additional reinforcements to support what he perceived as the critical point of battle. The housecarls, already in position, bound by military discipline to hold their assigned ground regardless of local conditions, could not effectively communicate the true tactical situation back to Harold's command post. The communication system was designed to send information upward from scouts to commanders, not to provide rapid feedback loops that might correct initial assessments. By 1215, nearly 1,000 Anglo-Saxon warriors, almost 1/7 of Harold's entire army, had been drawn away from the centre to address a threat that had never materialized beyond Leofric's misinterpretation of routine. Norman reconnaissance. The misallocation of reserves created exactly the tactical opportunity that Duke William had been seeking since the battle began. Norman scouts, positioned at carefully chosen observation points throughout the valley, had been monitoring Anglo-Saxon troop movements since dawn with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all of William's military operations. These observers reported immediately to William's command post that the English centre had been significantly weakened by the departure of reserve forces. The shield wall that had held firm against Norman attacks for 3 hours was now dangerously thin, with insufficient depth to absorb the kind of concentrated assault that might shatter the Anglo-Saxon line entirely. William faced his own critical command decision, one that would determine whether the Norman invasion succeeded or failed in the crucible of a single afternoon's fighting. He could continue the attritional combat that had characterized the morning, accepting steady but manageable casualties in exchange for gradual degradation of Anglo-Saxon defensive capability. Or he could risk everything on a single massive assault designed to shatter Harold's weakened centre in one decisive blow that would end Anglo-Saxon resistance and deliver England to Norman conquest. The choice reflected fundamental differences in medieval military philosophy. Conservative commanders preferred steady pressure that minimized risk while maximizing the probability of eventual success. Aggressive commanders sought decisive engagement that offered the possibility of total victory balanced against the risk of catastrophic defeat. William chose maximum aggression with the tactical audacity that had made him master of Normandy against overwhelming odds. Norman preparations for the grand assault began immediately with the efficiency of a military machine that had been perfected through years of campaign experience. Every available cavalry unit was recalled from diversionary attacks and holding actions. Reserve squadrons that had been waiting in the valley moved forward to assault positions. Infantry formations that had been conducting pressure attacks along the flanks repositioned to support the central advance. The logistics of coordinating such an attack was staggering by the standards of 11th century warfare. 3,000 Norman knights had to form up in proper tactical order, maintain alignment across a front that extended nearly half a mile, and advance simultaneously to achieve the concentration of force that would make the charge effective against prepared defensive positions. William's solution was a horn signal system that had been rehearsed extensively during the weeks of preparation in Normandy, when the invasion force had trained on beaches and fields that approximated the conditions they expected to encounter in England. 3 long blasts would signal general advance. 2 short blasts would indicate target priorities for individual squadrons. A continuous blast would order immediate withdrawal if the assault failed to achieve breakthrough. But the Norman communication system also incorporated provisions for battlefield flexibility that the Anglo-Saxon network tragically lacked. Subordinate commanders could send queries back to William's command post using predetermined combinations of horn calls. Reserve units could request permission to join ongoing attacks or report tactical opportunities that required immediate response. Individual squadrons could communicate tactical developments, enemy weakness, friendly casualties, terrain obstacles that might affect the overall conduct of the battle. This redundant communication capability, developed through years of campaign experience, would prove crucial during the climactic phase of the engagement. At 12:30, Norman horns sounded across the battlefield with a clarity that cut through the noise of combat like a blade through silk. 3 long, haunting notes that could be heard above the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded men signaled the beginning of the largest cavalry charge in medieval English history. From Station 7, Leofric the Keen-Eyed watched in growing horror as the consequences of his premature signal became devastatingly clear. The Norman demonstration on the right flank had been exactly that, a tactical deception designed to draw Anglo-Saxon reserves away from the critical point of battle where William intended to deliver his decisive blow. The beacon fire that continued to burn beside him had triggered precisely the response that Duke William had hoped to achieve through his feint. Harold's best warriors were now positioned to defend against an attack that had never been intended, while the centre of the Anglo-Saxon line waited with insufficient forces to repel the assault that was already building momentum on the slopes below. Leofric could see the Norman cavalry charge building speed as 3,000 knights urged their destriers up the blood-soaked slope toward Harold's weakened centre. He could see the thinned Anglo-Saxon shield wall preparing to receive an assault that might have been repelled if the reserves had remained in their original positions. He could see, with the terrible clarity that had earned him his nickname and made him valuable to Harold's army, that the battle was about to be lost through his own error in judgment. But there was no way to recall his signal, no method to correct his mistake, no mechanism to restore the tactical balance that his premature warning had destroyed. The beacon fire continued to burn, sending its false message into the October sky, while 3,000 Norman knights prepared to exploit the weakness that misunderstanding had created. Communication had failed at the moment when it was most desperately needed. Command authority had fragmented under the pressure of incomplete information and impossible decisions. Tactical cohesion had dissolved into fatal confusion. The breaking point had arrived, manufactured by the very system designed to prevent it. 3,000 Norman knights struck the centre of Harold's line with the concentrated force of an avalanche meeting bedrock, the sound of impact audible across the entire battlefield, a thunderclap composed of steel on wood, steel on steel, and the screams of horses and men dying in the service of their lords. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall, weakened by the withdrawal of nearly 1,000 reserves to counter Leofric's phantom threat, absorbed the initial shock with the grim determination that had made English warriors legendary throughout northern Europe. But the mathematics of medieval warfare were inexorable. Where Harold's centre had once been 4 ranks deep, with interlocking shields and overlapping spear points, it now stood only 2 ranks deep in many places, insufficient to maintain structural integrity under the kind of massive assault that William had unleashed. For 27 minutes, the outcome remained balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The battle's resolution, dependent on individual acts of courage and desperation, repeated thousands of times across a front that extended nearly 300 yards. The housecarls who remained in Harold's centre fought with the desperate fury of men who understood that their kingdom's survival depended on their individual performance in the next few minutes of combat. Danish axes, wielded by warriors who had trained with these weapons since childhood, carved through Norman armour as if it were parchment rather than interlocked steel rings forged by the finest armourers in France. English spears, thrust with the full force of men fighting for their homes and families and the freedom of their children, found gaps in Norman defences that should have been impenetrable to infantry weapons. Anglo-Saxon swords, many of them heirlooms passed down through generations of warriors, split Norman shields and shattered Norman lances with the accumulated skill of centuries. But numbers and momentum favoured the attackers with the cold logic of military mathematics. Where one Norman knight fell, pierced by Anglo-Saxon steel, or crushed by Anglo-Saxon axes, 2 more pressed forward to take his place. Where the Anglo-Saxon line wavered under the impact of charging destriers, Norman cavalry poured through the gaps like water through a broken dam, spreading chaos and destruction behind the English defensive positions. The Norman attack was not a single coordinated charge, but a series of hammer blows delivered with systematic precision across multiple points of the Anglo-Saxon line. William had divided his cavalry into squadrons of approximately 100 knights each, allowing him to concentrate overwhelming force against specific sectors while maintaining reserves to exploit any breakthrough that might develop. The first penetration occurred at 1251, approximately 100 yards east of Harold's command position, where the Anglo-Saxon line had been weakened not only by the departure of reserves, but also by 3 hours of continuous combat that had exhausted even the most experienced warriors. A squadron of Norman knights, led by a warrior whose name has been lost to history, but whose tactical skill was evident in his ability to identify and exploit the weak point in Harold's defences, broke through the Anglo-Saxon shield wall and spread out behind the English defensive line like a disease infecting healthy tissue. The breakthrough was narrow, perhaps 30 yards wide, but it created a tactical crisis that Harold's depleted reserves could not address. The 600 housecarls who might have sealed the gap and restored the integrity of the defensive line were still positioned on the right flank, defending against an attack that had never materialized beyond Leofric's misinterpretation of Norman reconnaissance. Harold himself, fighting in the front rank as Anglo-Saxon military tradition demanded of kings who expected their warriors to die for them, found his position increasingly desperate as Norman cavalry operating behind the main battle line began attacking the English command structure from multiple directions simultaneously. Medieval battles were often decided by the death or incapacitation of key leaders whose personal presence provided both tactical coordination and psychological inspiration for their armies. Harold's survival was essential not only for immediate command and control, but also for the long-term viability of Anglo-Saxon resistance to Norman conquest. But the king was now surrounded by enemies on 3 sides, his personal guard reduced to perhaps 50 men, and his ability to influence the broader tactical situation severely compromised by the immediate necessity of personal survival. At approximately 1:05, Harold Godwinson was struck by a Norman arrow fired by an archer whose identity remains unknown, but whose single shot would reshape the political structure of medieval Europe. The projectile struck the king in the right eye with sufficient force to penetrate his helmet and inflict what was almost certainly a mortal wound. Contemporary accounts disagree about whether Harold died immediately or continued fighting for several minutes after being struck. The Bayeux tapestry, commissioned by Norman patrons with obvious political motivations, suggests that the king fell instantly and was subsequently mutilated by Norman knights who reached his position. Other sources, primarily Anglo-Saxon chronicles written decades after the battle, indicate that Harold continued to wield his sword for some time after being wounded, fighting with the desperate courage of a king who knew that his death would mean the end of his kingdom's independence. What is historically certain is that Harold's effective command of the Anglo-Saxon army ended at approximately 1:05 on the afternoon of October 14th, 1066, whether through immediate death or incapacitation that prevented further military leadership. With their king dead or dying, the Anglo-Saxon army began to disintegrate according to the psychological dynamics that governed medieval warfare. But the collapse was neither immediate nor uniform. Different sectors of the battlefield developed according to their own tactical logic and the varying degrees of information available to local commanders. The Anglo-Saxon left flank, which had been engaged in heavy defensive fighting since the battle began, but had not been directly affected by the crisis in the center, conducted what military historians would recognize as a textbook fighting withdrawal when word of Harold's death reached their commanders. These forces, still largely intact, and maintaining reasonable tactical cohesion, retreated toward the forest that had protected their original positions, fighting rearguard actions that prevented Norman cavalry from achieving the kind of pursuit that might have annihilated Anglo-Saxon resistance entirely. The center, where Harold had fallen and where Norman penetration had been most complete, dissolved into individual combat as organized resistance became impossible. Norman cavalry and infantry systematically eliminated pockets of Anglo-Saxon warriors who continued fighting around the bodies of their dead leaders, taking few prisoners and showing little mercy to enemies who had inflicted such heavy casualties during the morning's fighting. But the right flank, where nearly 1,000 housecarls remained in position as a direct result of Leofric's premature signal, presented a tactical situation unlike anything that had developed elsewhere on the battlefield. These warriors were still in good military order, still capable of effective coordinated resistance, and still largely unaware of the full extent of the disaster that had befallen their army. They could observe that the centre had collapsed, and that Norman cavalry was operating behind the main Anglo-Saxon positions, but without direct communication from Harold's command post, they had no way to assess the broader tactical situation. Military discipline, the foundation of Anglo-Saxon military effectiveness, now worked against the survival of Harold's army. The housecarls on the right flank had been ordered to hold their positions against Norman flanking attacks. Those orders remained in effect until countermanded by proper authority, and proper authority no longer existed. This created a tactical anomaly that Duke William was perfectly positioned to exploit with the ruthless efficiency that had made him master of Normandy. Rather than facing coordinated resistance from Harold's entire surviving force, the Normans could defeat Anglo-Saxon units piecemeal, engaging each sector individually, while the others remained bound by military protocol to maintain their assigned positions. Norman cavalry units that had achieved breakthrough in the centre wheeled right and attacked the flank forces from behind, striking warriors who were still facing east toward the threat they had been dispatched to counter. These housecarls, among the finest infantry in medieval Europe, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by enemies approaching from unexpected directions. The final organized Anglo-Saxon resistance ended at approximately 2:15 when the last group of housecarls, trapped against the marshy ground that had originally protected their flank, were systematically destroyed by repeated Norman cavalry charges that left no survivors to carry word of their courage to later generations. From Station 7, Leofric the Keen-Eyed witnessed the complete destruction of the army he had served faithfully for 20 years and loved more than his own life. The beacon fire he had lit to protect his king had instead doomed him. The signal that was meant to preserve Anglo-Saxon England had instead delivered it to Norman conquest through the cruel mathematics of unintended consequences. Norman cavalry pursued the scattered remnants of Harold's forces across the Sussex countryside with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all of William's military operations. Few Anglo-Saxon warriors would survive to see sunset on October 14th. Fewer still would live to tell their children how England had been lost in a single afternoon through a scout's premature judgment and the fog of war that had made correct decision-making impossible. Duke William of Normandy, soon to be called William the Conqueror, had achieved one of the most complete victories in the history of medieval warfare. An entire army destroyed, a ruling class exterminated, a civilization overthrown through a combination of tactical skill and fortuitous circumstances that no military planner could have anticipated. But the victory had not been inevitable, and William understood this with the clarity that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. For 3 hours, Anglo-Saxon resistance had held firm against overwhelming odds and superior numbers. Harold's defensive strategy had been sound, his positions strong, his warriors as brave and skilled as any in Europe. The battle had been decided by communication failure, by the fog of war that made accurate assessment impossible, and by a single scout's decision to light a signal fire 30 minutes too soon. The Norman conquest of England had been achieved through tactical deception that succeeded beyond William's most optimistic expectations, creating an opportunity that military genius had been ready to exploit. The breaking point had been manufactured by misunderstanding, amplified by the chaos of combat, and exploited by an enemy commander who understood that victory often belonged to those who could adapt most quickly to unexpected circumstances. The Battle of Hastings ended at sunset on October 14th, 1066, with the field of Senlac Hill transformed into a monument to the fragility of kingdoms and the power of individual decisions to reshape the course of history. 7,000 Anglo-Saxon warriors had taken their positions on the ridge that morning. As darkness fell, fewer than 1,000 remained alive in any condition to continue resistance against Norman conquest. The dead lay in windrows where the shield wall had finally broken, their bodies testimony to courage that had proven insufficient against the mathematics of medieval warfare. King Harold Godwinson's corpse, mutilated beyond recognition according to some accounts, lay somewhere among the carnage that had once been the centre of his battle line. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine had fallen beside him, along with virtually every member of the Anglo-Saxon nobility who had answered his summons for the defence of England. The House of Godwin, which had dominated English politics for 2 generations, had been extinguished in a single afternoon. The earls who had governed the great shires, the thengs who had maintained local order, the housecarls who had formed the military elite of Anglo-Saxon England all lay dead on the slopes below Hastings, their blood soaking into soil that would remember their sacrifice for centuries. Norman casualties, while significant by the standards of medieval warfare, were proportionally much lighter than the devastation they had inflicted. Approximately 1,800 Norman, Breton, and Flemish warriors had fallen during the day's fighting, including many of Duke William's most experienced knights, and several of the barons who had invested their fortunes in the invasion enterprise. But the core leadership of William's forces remained intact. The Duke himself had survived unharmed despite fighting in the front rank during the climactic cavalry charge. His principal lieutenants, Odo of Bayeux, Robert of Mortain, William Fitzosborne, were alive and capable of continuing the conquest that Hastings had made possible. More importantly, the Norman victory had been so complete that it eliminated organized Anglo-Saxon resistance for the immediate future. There would be no second battle, no rallying of surviving forces, no coordinated campaign to expel the invaders. The entire structure of Anglo-Saxon political and military authority had collapsed with Harold's death, but the immediate military victory was only the beginning of William's conquest of England. Medieval kingdoms did not surrender simply because their armies had been destroyed in a single battle. Resistance could continue through guerrilla warfare, regional rebellion, and the gradual erosion of occupying forces that were far from home and surrounded by hostile populations. England in 1066 was not a unified nation-state, but a collection of regional powers held together by personal loyalties, traditional obligations, and the military strength of whoever occupied the throne. Harold's death removed the central authority that had coordinated Anglo-Saxon resistance, but it did not automatically transfer legitimacy to Norman rule. William's response to this challenge was systematic and brutal, reflecting the same strategic thinking that had made his victory at Hastings possible. Rather than attempting to rule through existing Anglo-Saxon institutions, he implemented a comprehensive program of political, military, and cultural transformation that would remake England according to Norman models. The harrying of the North in 1069 and 1070 represented perhaps the most severe internal warfare that England had experienced since the Viking invasions of the 9th century. Entire counties were systematically devastated to prevent future rebellion. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and populations dispersed or killed. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after Hastings, records Yorkshire as largely uninhabited, a testament to the thoroughness of Norman reprisals against regions that had attempted to resist the conquest. Similar devastation was inflicted on other areas where Anglo-Saxon resistance had persisted beyond William's tolerance for opposition. Anglo-Saxon landowners were systematically dispossessed and replaced with Norman barons who owed their positions entirely to William's favour. The great estates that had supported Anglo-Saxon nobility for generations were redistributed as rewards for Norman military service. English religious institutions were reorganized under Norman ecclesiastical authority, with Anglo-Saxon abbots and bishops replaced by continental appointees. The cultural transformation was equally comprehensive and longer-lasting than the immediate political changes. Norman French became the language of government, law, and literature, relegating English to the status of a peasant dialect spoken by the conquered population. Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions gave way to Norman architectural and decorative styles that can still be observed in English churches and castles built during the decades following the conquest. The social structures that had governed English life for centuries were replaced by continental feudalism, a system that formalized the military obligations and land tenure arrangements that had developed more organically under Anglo-Saxon rule. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, England had become essentially a Norman colony rather than a conquered Anglo-Saxon kingdom. But what of the individuals whose decisions had shaped this historic catastrophe? Duke William himself ruled both Normandy and England until his death in 1087, 21 years after his victory at Hastings. He never returned to his birthplace, dying at Rouen while preparing for yet another military campaign against rebellious vassals who had never fully accepted Norman authority. William's reign in England was marked by constant warfare, administrative innovation, and cultural transformation that created the foundations of medieval English government. The governmental institutions he established, the system of royal justice, the methods of taxation, the integration of military service with land tenure, would influence English political development for centuries. King Harold's body was eventually recovered from the battlefield and buried, according to various accounts, either at Waltham Abbey in Essex or in an unmarked grave near the battlefield itself. Later legends claimed that Harold had survived Hastings and lived as a hermit, but these stories were almost certainly wishful thinking by Anglo-Saxon chroniclers who could not accept the finality of their defeat. Harold's surviving family members were either killed, exiled, or reduced to insignificance within the new Norman order. His daughter Gytha fled to Denmark, where she married into the royal family but never posed a serious threat to Norman control of England. His sons launched several unsuccessful invasion attempts from Ireland, but these efforts lacked the resources and support necessary to challenge William's increasingly secure rule. And what of Leofric the Keen-Eyed, whose premature signal had contributed to the destruction of the army he had served faithfully for 20 years? Norman records make no mention of individual Anglo-Saxon scouts, reflecting the systematic effort to erase Anglo-Saxon identity from the historical record of the conquest. Most likely, Leofric died during the general slaughter that followed the collapse of Harold's centre, his body indistinguishable from thousands of other Anglo-Saxon warriors who had fallen in defence of their kingdom. His beacon fire, the signal that had helped doom his own cause, burned out sometime during the afternoon of October 14th, its smoke dissipating into the October sky along with the hopes of Anglo-Saxon independence. However, fragments of later Anglo-Saxon chronicles, preserved in monasteries in Ireland and Scotland, where refugees from Norman persecution had carried their memories and their manuscripts, suggest that some survivors of Hastings preserved the story of the scout who lit the fire too soon. These accounts, written decades after the battle by monks who had fled their homeland rather than submit to Norman religious authority, describe Leofric's decision as a moment when individual error transformed into historical catastrophe. But they do not condemn the scout personally, recognizing that he had acted according to his training, his understanding of the tactical situation, and his absolute loyalty to his king. His error had been temporal rather than moral, a failure of timing that occurred under the extreme pressure of combat decision-making, when accurate assessment was impossible and hesitation could prove just as fatal as premature action. Yet the consequences had been enormous beyond any proportion to the individual decision that had triggered them. Military historians have calculated that if Harold's reserves had remained in their original positions, the Norman cavalry charge would likely have failed against the full strength of the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, which had already demonstrated its ability to repel Norman attacks throughout the morning's fighting. The battle might have ended in stalemate, requiring William to attempt a siege of Harold's positions that could have lasted weeks or months. Norman morale and supplies might have been exhausted by prolonged campaign far from their bases in Normandy. The invasion might have failed entirely, leaving England under Anglo-Saxon rule and altering the entire subsequent course of European history. Such speculation is ultimately impossible to verify, but it illustrates the profound impact that individual decisions can have on historical outcomes when they occur at critical moments in complex systems that amplify small changes into massive consequences. The Norman conquest established patterns of governance, law, and culture that shaped not only England, but the entire development of medieval Europe. The feudal system that William imported from Normandy became the foundation of English social organization. The administrative methods he developed for governing a conquered population influenced colonial practices for centuries. The English language itself bears the permanent imprint of Norman influence, with its vocabulary permanently divided between Germanic roots inherited from Anglo-Saxon England and Romance borrowings introduced by Norman French administration. Legal terminology, governmental vocabulary, military language, and social distinctions all reflect the linguistic transformation that followed political conquest. English architectural styles were fundamentally altered by Norman models that emphasized stone construction, systematic planning, and decorative elements derived from continental traditions. The parish churches, castles, and cathedrals built during the Norman period created a physical landscape that still defines much of the English countryside. All of these developments, and countless others that shaped the subsequent millennium of English and European history, trace back at least partially to a scout's decision to light a signal fire when he should have waited 30 more minutes for tactical clarity that might never have come. Modern military doctrine emphasizes redundant communication systems precisely because of disasters like Hastings, where single points of failure can trigger cascading catastrophes that destroy entire armies. No individual signal should trigger major tactical decisions. No single observer should bear sole responsibility for critical intelligence gathering. Multiple sources must confirm important information before commanders commit reserves or alter defensive positions. But in 1066, such safeguards did not exist and could not have been implemented with available technology. Medieval armies depended on the judgment of individual scouts, the reliability of single messengers, and the accuracy of isolated observations made under impossible conditions by men whose training could never fully prepare them for the complexities they would face. The margin for error was essentially zero, while the consequences of error could be infinite. Leofric, the keen-eyed, possessed all the qualities that had made him valuable to Harold's army: exceptional eyesight that could identify enemy formations at distances that amazed his contemporaries, the ability to make rapid decisions under extreme pressure, and absolute loyalty to his king and his cause that had been proven through years of faithful service. But he also possessed the human limitations that made him dangerous in a position where individual judgment could determine the fate of kingdoms: the tendency to interpret ambiguous information in the worst possible light, the inclination to act decisively rather than wait for perfect clarity that might never arrive, and the inability to foresee all consequences of immediate decisions made under combat pressure. These same characteristics appear in military disasters throughout history, from ancient times to the present day. The pattern remains consistent across centuries and cultures. Individual decisions made under extreme pressure with incomplete information cascade into strategic catastrophe when institutional safeguards prove inadequate to prevent human error from triggering systemic failure. The Battle of Hastings represents this dynamic in its purest form: a single scout, acting on partial information and imperfect understanding, lighting a beacon fire that would burn down a kingdom and reshape the political structure of medieval Europe. The smoke from Leofric's fire rose into the October sky and carried with it not just a mistaken tactical signal, but the end of Anglo-Saxon England, the beginning of Norman rule, and the transformation of English civilization that would endure for 1,000 years. What happened here was not merely a defeat. It was a lesson, written in blood, studied by those who came after, and often ignored.